So, let's do like the shortest recap of what happened last time. Okay?
2,000 years.
Yeah, well, really briefly, I mean, I know the last one we did the history of the Bible. First off, did you guys feel like you got something out of that? I feel like I got a lot out of it. It was really, really fun to actually sit down and put it together. But the last thing that we did before that was, congratulations, the Roman Empire is now Christian. Now we got a whole other set of problems. Okay? And that whole other set of problems that happens is actually everybody that's outside the Roman Empire. In fact, there's a great quote from Jerome, the same guy who did the Vulgate Bible, who translated the Bible into Latin. He said, "The world goes to ruins, yes, but in spite of it, and to our shame, our sins still live and even prosper. The great city, the capital of the Roman Empire, has been devoured by a great fire, and all over the earth, Romans wander in exile. Churches which once were revered are now but dust and ashes." Thank you, Germany. Can't blame them completely. Now, basically what happened is the Roman Empire was huge. And remember how Byzantium, then Constantinople, becomes the heart of the church and the empire. But the one thing was, and we couldn't cover too much of it because then we're going into a whole thing about Roman history. Starting in 284 AD under the Emperor Diocletian, that Roman Empire, which is all of like basically Europe and Palestine and North Africa, was so big that it was divided in half. And they had two emperors. They had the Eastern Emperor and the Western Emperor. And it's under Constantine, he's like, no. We got to control everything. And where Byzantium pretty much becomes like the power control of that area. Even though they still have that one person there in Rome as a representative of the Roman Empire. Now, we also talked about, really quickly, in one of the Apostolic Fathers, we talked about Augustine of Hippo. And when Augustine of Hippo died, the Vandals, which are another Germanic tribe, were already at the gates. And they start turning more towards west into Europe, which is a lot more vulnerable, because Rome didn't have that much of a control over it. So the Vandals, they head towards Rome, they can't beat down Rome, and so they just like spread out throughout Europe. Now, in 378 AD, at a place called the Battle of Adrianople, the emperor is killed by Goths. And then, 410 AD, Rome itself is sacked. The city that was unbeatable has been beaten. It's not gone, but it's a big bloody blow towards the Roman Empire, when the main city. And then Germanic hordes just make their way through Europe. That is what Europe looked like after the fall of the Roman Empire. These are all the people that took care of it. It all got chopped up very quickly. Now, Leo, right here, he's a bishop in Rome in 455. And Leo has great authority over Rome. He also felt that Rome should be the seat of power of the church, not Constantinople. Because, he said, Jesus made Peter and his successors to be the rock of the church, and so the bishop of Rome is to be the head of the church. This will lead to a schism between the Western and Eastern Christianity. He will also be the head of the council, at the council of what's known as Chalcedon, which is in Turkey, on doctrine such as Trinitarianism, rules for clerics, as well as working on contract marriages, which were prevalent at the time, and where priests can and cannot receive communion, such as visiting priests. If you're a priest from one city and you travel to another city, you cannot receive communion in a traveling city, in the city in which you are visiting. You can only receive communion in which the city you were originally attached to. Yes?
So he just started making up rules?
Yeah, pretty much. Such as, well, really quickly, that's an excellent point you're bringing. Don't say anything, because I know he's going to pipe up. And you might pipe up as well. How many sacraments are there in church? Things that Christ had done.
2.
2. How many did the Catholic Church have? 7.
75.
Yeah, 75 altogether. Talk about making things up as we go along. That's exactly what happened. Now, a note really quickly on bishops and popes of Rome. It's really quickly. I mean, we could go into it, but I mean, there's like a whole class just on popes. The bishops and the popes of Rome have always been pretty much a steady succession. Although, several times in history, you'll get multiple popes at one time, to where they can't agree who should be the pope. And so everybody will have a contention, and sometimes popes will even go to war over who gets to be the pope. Yeah, political. Yes?
Sorry, I forgot. Did we already talk about the first pope being established? Like when that happened?
The first person that would be like the official pope
Yeah.
will be Leo
Oh,
in 455. There are other people that will claim later, under especially Catholic theology, that there are earlier popes than that, but basically anybody who is the Bishop of Rome, or will be assigned as Bishop of Rome, could officially be called the Papa or Pope. But Leo is the first one to say that's it, religious power should be seated in Rome, not Constantinople. Now, this is what happens, 476 AD. Whoops, I went backwards. You can't see this. Look away! There we go. Rob's like, I don't know how I'm going to edit that out. Okay, this is what happens. 476. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is deposed in Rome. Barbarians officially take over all of Italy. That is officially the end of the Western Roman Empire. The worst part is, he's like 12. And he dies in exile. And as I mentioned, this is how Rome got broken up. So we still have what's Eastern Roman Empire, which all the way up to the 1450s was called the Holy Roman Empire. They're like, you know, we are the bastion of civilization. While we have over here, the kingdom of Odoacer, we have the Visigoths, Burgundians. Everybody's like, what's a Burgundian? He's French-German. Then we have Siracius, Alani, the Franks. Those are some interesting guys. And then, of course, over here, Angles, Saxons, and Britons, where we get the word Great Britain from. Okay? They're also some very interesting people as well. Now, the Visigoth Christian leader at the time, so we actually have this area right here, which is France and parts of Spain. His name is Isidore Seville. He's a Christian leader in the area. And he actually tries to preserve as much of ancient wisdom as he can. Not just religious stuff, but everything else as well. And he created a book that was called the Entomologies. And this is considered to be the finest collection of ancient knowledge that has been lost. And why do we say that? Because everybody always goes, especially if you like ancient history people, they're like, well, what about the Library of Alexandria? You guys ever heard of that? Alexandria, which is in Egypt. When Alexander the Great took over that area, he gave all that land after he died to Ptolemy I, who was one of his generals, and Ptolemy created what was known as the Library of Alexandria. It was supposed to be the largest library in the world, containing up to 500,000 books. It was all the ancient knowledge of the world. Unfortunately, it was burned in the 270s. And then the auxiliary library for it, which is called the Serapeum of Alexandria, was destroyed in 391. So all that knowledge is gone. Including with one of the things really quickly, because like I said, I'm a nerd. Can you guys guess? Did you know Rome actually, well, not Rome, well, the early part of the Roman Republic, as well as the Greeks, actually had the steam engine.
Really?
Yeah, it's created by a guy named Hero. He actually devised the idea of a steam engine and a very simple piston and made toys out of it. He just couldn't find a practical use for it. And all of that knowledge was lost in Alexandria. Imagine where we would have been if the Library of Alexandria was still in existence today. All that knowledge of math, sciences, and everything was compiled. All the knowledge of the known world at that time was lost.
How to build pyramids.
Yeah, well, that's actually not too bad.
They can't figure it out.
Actually, they can.
Oh, they can't?
That's a myth, that they don't know how to build pyramids. Yeah, they're actually using the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared.
They didn't know how the men did it, right?
Yeah.
Well-
They didn't have cranes.
They didn't know how
Well, you don't need cranes. You just use, yeah, you use sand.
Sand.
Yeah, you know what? You got a few dozen years, you got 10,000 slaves, and you don't have an Xbox One, you got a lot of time on your hands. I do love how you say that, but that's one of the things I love. Really quickly, Rob's gonna kill me. I'm like, how do you keep getting off track? Because of her. Okay? No, really quickly, one of my favorite things. Like I said, I teach ancient world to little kids, 6th graders. Okay? And one of the things I love is every once in a while there's a kid that says, aliens built the pyramids. you guys heard of that, right? It's really funny. Because they don't understand the difference between an aboriginal technology versus a technology that's introduced from an outside source. See, the ancient Egyptians started building these things that are called mastobas. And they're basically simple adobe structures, just like what you see out here in California. Okay? Mud, straw, you know? And then, so that's what they used to use as their tombs. And then somebody said, I want one of those, but make it bigger. Typical guy, you know? And so they built a smaller mastaba on top of it. It's the beginning of a step pyramid. And then, because it's made out of adobe, next thing you know, it collapses on itself because it's a mud brick. So they start making them out of stone. So most of the pyramids in Egypt are step pyramids, a lot like you see in Mexico and Central America. The final ones that you see in like outside of Cairo and stuff, those are the final pyramids, the ones that come up to a point. That's the last evolution of them. And so basically, those pointed pyramids are step pyramids with final blocks put in place to make them just simply look like they're going up to a point. They're just stones that are cut at an angle to bring it up. Yeah. That's the whole thing, is that they knew how they were built, and it's like that huge perpetuation that everybody likes to say, oh, they don't know how they did it. You have an army of slaves and you got a lot of time on your hands. It's like for Stonehenge. How did they build Stonehenge?
Same way.
It's the same thing. It's a group of people committed to a single effort. For the Celts, it was by their own religious devotion. The Egyptians, it's out of, I got 10,000 slaves, I'm going to make them do some cool stuff for me. And that's exactly how Egypt became this huge empire. Whew, that was totally off track. All right, now, 586. A pope by the name of Pelagius, during the time of the Lombards, attack Italy, and an epidemic breaks out through Rome. The pope, with the help of a simple monk by the name of Gregory, and they actually set up a whole idea of sanitation for the city, because that's what keeps plagues going, lack of sanitation. Okay, and so they set up a sanitation system in the city, and they help deal with the feeding of the hungry. And then the next thing that happens, the Pope dies. Gregory does not want the job. Gregory, unfortunately, gets the job. Gregory becomes Pope. Gregory makes great efforts to stabilize Rome, including improving sanitation, securing a wheat shipment from Sicily, and then he actually starts going out and preaching in all the churches in Rome, urging the faithful to return, and sends envoys to England as well as Africa. So he's trying to unite the church. The thing is, too, he is also the first pope that goes deep into preaching the idea of purgatory. The idea that the soul will be in a state of flux. Which, of course, you can pray that person out of a state of flux. Or, even better, you could pay somebody to pray to get that person out of a state of flux. That is the beginning of the Reformation. It comes out of that. Now, what happens, there's Gregory, there's a Visigoth king by the name of Recared. And under Recared, he becomes converted to the Catholic faith in 587. And after that, the church will actually play a huge part of the role of the legislations of the state for the Visigoths. And one of the acts under Recared and Isidore is that Jews who were then forced to convert to the Christian faith, they no longer forced that. That's what they were doing. They were forcing Jews to become Christians. But they said, you no longer are forced to be a Christian, but you cannot go back to Judaism, nor can you actually converse with people who still are Jews. They're separating them and not allowing them to converse with each other. Now, the Burgundians, let's go back to our map. The Burgundians are Arians. Remember how we talked about how that one theological idea that Jesus was simply a pawn by God and then given power and then the power is taken away. While the second major group in that time, the Franks, are pagan. But what happens is Clovis, who's a Frank king at the time, becomes baptized on Christmas Day. And after that, almost all the major nobles start being baptized as Christian. But we're still having that difference between that Arianism and the Nicene thought, to where Nicene is God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit all exist at one time, Trinitarianism, while we have Arianism, which is there's God, and then Jesus is separate, later brought in. Now, so the Franks, the Burgundians, Kino-Vodisser, and the Visigoths are all now becoming Christian. But the only thing is, you still got a huge chunk right over here that is not. The Lombard kingdom as well. And there's a huge problem here with the Britons. But the only thing is, the Britons are actually fairly safe. They got water. An island unto itself. And because of that, the monasteries of Ireland, Scotland, and parts of England will flourish. And they'll have huge manufacturing of early Bibles will come out of Ireland, as well as England during this time period, including, we talked about it last week, the very famous Book of Kells. And also we talked about how they changed the language during that time period. That insular way of separating words, as opposed to everything running together, now makes reading Bibles a lot easier. Now, there is also something else that happens during this time period that was pretty interesting. Miaphysites. I can't even say it. Don't make me explain it. Because, in all honesty, I'm still having trouble wrapping my noggin around it. This is basically what it is. It's a theological issue that comes up at the time. It's a Christological formula that the nature of Jesus Christ, united in his divine and human nature, is a compound, the two being without mixture, without separation, and without alteration. What does that mean? They're kind of like doing the difference between Jesus the man versus Jesus the divine being. Okay? So there's a huge theological point that's going on during this time period. And it really kicks off with one person is the Bishop of Constantinople. And in 428, his name is Nestorius, Nestorius. He makes a theological play on it. And the word is called physis. Darn you, Latin language. Okay? And the term physis is the nature of Christ. Now, the way he says it, and the way he tries to describe it, is he uses the idea of a Greek mask in theater. And the term for that he uses is prosporon, which is what they called the mask that the Greeks used to wear in theater. So they'd say that his whole idea is that Jesus Christ is the human form of him, while the mask represents the divinity, and so the voice is projected, and so you actually hear the voice of the divinity. My only question is, at this point in juncture, does anybody care? See, I mean, remember, what does Paul instruct us? To be like children. Then you receive the faith. They're already bickering over what is the human versus divinity of Christ. And then, probably one of the things that he actually, I think, did something that was quite a power play during this time period, which upset a lot of people, the worshiping of the Virgin Mary. Okay? Now, that's been going on since the very beginning. Remember how we talk about from people going from that Roman to Christian, the idea of the mother goddess. In fact, this is Sabile, the mother goddess, the creator of all nature. They even got the colors right. The red gown with the blue mantle. And Nestorius was, he actually was the first person to really go against this. But the only thing is who was supporting this mindset? The Nicenes. The people that believed in the Trinity from the very beginning. They backed it as opposed to Arianism. And the reason they backed up the idea of this is because it gives Jesus the legitimacy that he is divine from her womb, as opposed to he's born human, and then God gives him that. By making her divine too, now it's everybody is in a godlike stature. And so the Nicenes actually use it as a tool against Arianism. And the one thing is it'll affect the empire forever. It still does. And of all things, we will talk about him a little later today. The creator of Islam, Muhammad, actually made a comment on it, which I think is worth saying. He said, "Believe therefore in God and his apostles and say that there are not three gods. Forbear this, it'll be better for you. There are three gods in which he spoke were the Father, the Son, and the Virgin Mary." And that is from Muhammad. Now, this is what this is called. It's called a Theotokos. It's Greek. It means a bearer of God. And Nestorius cites that the Theotokos is nonsense. And he says, the Word of God is the creator of time, and he is not created within time. And stating that she was a revival of the mother goddess. So he went directly against the church on this. And then because of that, he will lose his argument and be theologically condemned. He will lose his power. And then, of course, Islam. Now, the one thing is out of this is Christianity has a hold and is blossoming throughout the empire during this time period. Whether it's Arianism or it's the Nicene. They'll eventually come together under the Nicene theory. But something interesting happens out of this. It's out of Arabia. And it actually comes with a man by the name of Muhammad. And he's actually a merchant. And he has contact with both Jews and Christians during this time. And he claims that during a series of dreams, he has become a prophet. And all of these dreams come to him by the angel Gabriel. So, his real starts up around 610 and goes to 632. Muslim tradition believes that he's actually born in 570, and they call him the seal of the prophets. And during his time, Muhammad actually preached in Mecca, imploring them to abandon polytheism, which is good, and putting them to the worship of only one God. Although only some of them converted to Islam, some went to Christianity, the leading Meccan authorities persecuted Muhammad and his followers. So Muhammad actually leaves that place, and he starts setting up in a different area known as Medina. And eventually what happened is the famous book, the Quran, is written, which basically means recitation. And they start formulating what's known as the Islamic Constitution, which is security of the community, religious freedom, the role of Medina as a sacred place, the security of women, stable tribal relations with Medina, a tax system for supporting the community in time of conflict, parameters for exogenous political alliances, and a system for granting protection for individuals. And they also set up a judicial system for resolving disputes amongst non-Muslims, because it did not apply to Muslim law. Now, the only thing is it flourished greatly all the way up till Muhammad's death in 632. And it slowly made its way into certain parts of the old empire. It made its way into North Africa, Palestine, parts of Eastern Europe, and Spain, by way of going from North Africa and then crossing over into Spain. It's a short jump. And so, but the one thing is that it slowly made its way in under the kind of idea that you could be living in a Muslim-controlled area and still be Christian and Jew. You were heavily taxed for it, but you could still coexist in that area. And then, with his death in 632, there's a disagreement over who would succeed him as a leader. And that actually, I don't even want to get into because it's like a big old jumble. But there are two factions, and they will later be known today as the Sunnis and the Shiites. And boy, they still hate each other today. And that's been going since 632. That's a chip. Okay? But, can I bring out my inner nerd? Is that okay? Alright, this is like one of my favorite stories about this. It's not one of my favorite stories, trust me, but it's one of my favorite stories about this. So, it's the Sunnis versus the Shiites. They've been going at it since 632. One Shiite leader decides he's got a plan. He's going to masterstroke a whole series of political killings. He's going to go after Sunni leaders under the goal of we're going to do as many political killings in neighboring areas so we can control that area. And so, his followers dedicate to the idea of how to sneak in and do a killing. The only thing is they're like, should we use bows? Should we do this? And then they realize all the logistical problems that could happen with all these things. Poison, there could be antidotes, all these things. So they finally decide that they're going to do the idea of a political killer. And it's very successful. In fact, it's so successful that the Sunnis actually say that the only way that these Shiites can succeed is because they feel no fear. And the only reason they feel no fear is because they smoke hashish, which was against the Muslim faith, the taking of drugs. And so they called these guys who felt no fear the Hashashins, people who do hash. And the political killings has kept on going all the way up into the Crusades. And so the first European that came in got to hear the legend of the Hashashins. And of course, his Anglo tongue had no way to wrap around that. And so he called them assassins. The term for a political killing comes from Hashashin. And they mastered it. But this whole area that we talked about, North Africa, parts of Spain, Eastern Europe, will start becoming under Muslim rule. And they will take over a lot of what was early Christian sites. Muhammad himself actually claimed that he was not preaching a new religion, but a culmination of what God revealed to him, to the Hebrews, and through Jesus. They do refer to Jesus as a prophet, but not as a savior. And Quran actually is designed for memorization. And there are 5 pillars to Islam. Radical monotheism. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. That is their staple. Ritual prayer, zakat, or almsgiving, which actually turned into radical taxation. If you were non-Muslim, then your required almsgiving was doubled. Fasting at Ramadan, the celebration of the month the Quran was given to Muhammad. Haji, or the pilgrimage every adult male must make to Mecca. And, of course, probably the most common thing, it's not part of the 5 pillars, but it will become known as jihad. What we call holy war, to them simply means to suffer or strife for the Islamic faith. So they will become a major power, and they will actually take over areas of Christianity, such as Jerusalem, Antioch, Damascus, Alexandria, and Carthage will go under Muslim rule. So basically, I need more maps. This whole area of North Africa is all Muslim. This whole area will become Muslim, as well as they're really going to feel the burn right over here. Start pushing, and it'll be all through the Mediterranean, this section, all throughout Palestine as well. And so, let's talk about who become a major power player against this. Charles, also known as Charlemagne. Charlemagne will become crowned king in 800 on Christmas morning, and he'll actually bring back the Roman Empire. He starts major invasions against Saxons as well as Frisians, which is to the north of Europe, and he'll start securing the borders against Moorish invasions as well. Christianity flourishes during this time period. Manuscripts are copied. This is also a time of huge theological debates. This is what happens when we have time on our hands. Okay? The Bishop of Toledo will actually start up a huge amount of theological debates. Charlemagne will expand and reform church's governance, and he'll also focus on strengthening the church power structure, improving clergy skill and moral quality, standardizing practices, improvements in basic tenets of the faith, as well as rooting out paganism. his authority extends over church and state, almost like one of the early Roman emperors. And he also develops huge support from the clergy, who approve of his desires to deepen the piety and moral of the subjects of the Frankish Empire. And by that time, that Frankish Empire will go to France, it will go all the way east into Germany, and it will drop down into Spain. It becomes one of the largest known kingdoms of Europe during that time period. He'll control all of that. Now, in 809 to 810, Charlemagne calls a church council in a place called Aachen, which is Aachen, which confirmed a unanimous belief in the West that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. So we're going right into that Trinitarianism. And also, during this time period, the Pope and the kings are now coming together and working on agreeing what is theology and what is not. And he goes to the Pope asking for approval of this doctrine and approval of the use of its teaching. And so this is how it changes. This spoke of the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father without adding phrases such as "and the Son," "through the Son," or "alone," and creeds. This stresses opposition, and so they have this huge bitter thing of, well, let's read it in Latin. What does it say in Latin? Oh, that says that in Latin? Well, let's go and read it in Greek. What does it say in Greek? So everybody, they're nitpicking about theology once again. And also during this time, under Charlemagne, you're going to have a huge invasion from the north, under Norsemen and Vikings. What will happen? They will sack many monasteries and make their way all the way into the Mediterranean, and will even take over Sicily. And then during this whole time, Charlemagne and the papacy will battle it out. In fact, that's one of the things is that a lot of people are, how far did the Vikings get? The Vikings were actually the bodyguards for the emperor in Byzantium and Constantinople. I mean, it's like when you think about it, what would you rather have? Would you rather have the 5'6" guy guarding the emperor, or do you want the 6'3" guy wielding the battle axe guarding the emperor? As well as the Vikings will make their way all the way into Russia. That's where it comes from, the Rus, the tribe of Vikings. That's where you get the word Russia from. Now, also a great controversy that happens during the Carolingian Empire is transubstantiation. Yikes. The idea that the actual bread and wine becomes the blood and flesh of Christ during communion. It'll actually, a monk by the name of Robertus will declare that the bread and wine literally become the flesh. And some bought it, some didn't, but by the 13th century it will become doctrine. That during the communion in the Catholic faith, during communion, the bread and the wine literally become the flesh and blood of Christ. Now, another thing that happens during this time period, which is called simony. Just think of the word Simon with a Y on the end. It is the buying and selling of ecclesiastical titles. I've got a nephew. I think he'll make a great bishop. Boom, he's bishop. That was huge during this time period. Okay? And another thing that would happen is they will also finally settle, and it takes them all the way up till 1070, that priests must be celibate. Now, this is also the beginning of what becomes known as...
Charles?
Yes?
Before that, did priests have families at that point?
technically they weren't supposed to, but you'd be surprised at who did. Including even all the way up into the Renaissance, there were some popes that had families. Yeah, they did. Who's that famous family? I can't remember. They had a,
Medici.
not the Medicis, although yeah, Borgia.
Yeah.
The Borgia was a pope. He had his wife and his children living at the Vatican, along with his mistress, but that's another story.
Charles,
Yes?
is it true that they did the whole celibate thing for priests because of passing on, when someone dies and their inheritance? Did it have to do with that?
I don't know if it has anything to do with the legalism of that. I do know that it had a lot to do with the idea of, from the direction of Paul, that if you are single, you are to give up the flesh and embrace the spirit. You know, and if your flesh burns, then it is better for you to marry. But I think it has to do with the separation of people, especially men, into the idea of being celibate, to dedicate themselves to church life. Is there anything you want to add on that, Rob? I mean, that's an excellent question that she has.
I have very little information about popes.
Thank you for throwing me under the bus, Rob.
Even the bishops and the priests.
Yeah.
All the little churches all over.
Yeah.
That's what I heard, that.
They may have done that
Who got the property.
to prevent
When
the
the
trend.
priest-
Yeah, the trend. When you think about it, it makes totally perfect sense. You could say it's for theological issues, but when a priest dies, all of his property will then go to the son or the wife. So you can keep everything within the church if everybody is celibate.
Right.
Yeah.
That's where it stays.
Yes, sir.
Were there nuns?
During this time period, they were having females that were going into the church, for the, as in their own monasteries. In a way, they were completely separate from the males during this time period. And then we have Charlemagne's empire. Okay, so here's Italy. Okay? So over here we got the West Frankish Empire that's ran by the Charles the Bald. These are all descendants from Charlemagne. And then we have Central Kingdom, and then we have the Eastern Kingdom. And then all of this, and this, this right here, this is what's called the States of the Church. Just like how the Vatican City is like its own independent country, this is its own little independent country right here. This is not held up by the laws of the Central Kingdom. This is our own little ocean going on. But because of the influx of, see, right here, here's an interesting word, caliphate. This is all Moorish controlled. Okay? And this gives rise to the militarization of Christianity for the first time, where they can no longer just naturally stand by. And so what's known as just war theory starts up. When can we fight in a war, and what is our behavior to be during this war? That's actually a theory that's been kicked around since the ancients. They talked about it, but it didn't become really popular until Augustine of Hippo wrote about it, and then Thomas Aquinas. And the purpose of this doctrine is to ensure that war is morally justifiable through a series of criteria, all of which must be met for a war to be considered just. Whatever that means. Okay? The criteria is split into two groups, rights to go to war and right conduct in war. The first concerns the morality of going to a war, and the second is the moral conduct within war. Recently there has been called for inclusion of a third category of just war called just post bellum, which is dealing with the morality of post-war settlement and reconstruction. That's actually still going on, the idea of just war theory. Can I show you my wicked twisted sense of humor? This is how I feel about just war theory. He's reading a book about the ethics of war as he's taking a mace to his friend.
Oh, jeez.
In the end, just war theory is just a theory. Doesn't necessarily work. Okay? Just like people who say, was it Rob and I were having lunch? There's always those people that say, communism looks great on paper. No, it doesn't. Things that work look great on paper. Just war theory doesn't necessarily work. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't have any great things to say, like no massacres, no reprisal kills, or anything like that. I think that's great. But in the end, the whole idea of just war, I mean, this is just me talking, guys. I hate to say it. I mean, I'm old school. Come on, old school. And there's an old Spanish saying, when swords are drawn, there are no rules. So, what happens out of this is birth of the Crusades. From 1096 to 1204. Major military campaigns to reclaim what was once previously Christian Holy Lands that were then taken in as Moorish territories. So we actually have this light purple area. These are all Western Christian lands. This area, Byzantium, what's left of Constantinople and the Holy Roman Empire, this little spot right here, as well as this area, these are Christian lands. And then everything else in green is Islamic. This is what I'm really going to say about the Crusades. Next to the Spanish Inquisition, this is probably the #1 example of how not to be a Christian. The Crusades, don't get me started. My friend Rick, he's also. I think they were necessary, but at the same time, they brought out the worst in people. On both sides, there are no winners. Okay? And how do you know what is a just war and what isn't? Well, during this time period, 1095, before the First Crusade launches, this is the declaration of a just war. It's actually a proclamation that is given by Pope Urban I. And this is what he proclaimed. I say to those who are present, and I command it to be said to those who are absent, Christ commands it. All who go thither and lose their lives, be it on the road or on the sea or in the fight against the pagans, will be granted immediate forgiveness of their sins. This I grant to all who will march by virtue of the great gift of God that has been given to me. Basically what he gave is a license to kill. Go to Islamic held lands and kill the pagan, and if you die, you will be given immediate granting to heaven. Forgiveness of your sins. Sounds a lot like another group of people out there. Yeah. And so, they actually have 3 major campaigns that start up. And it actually improved a lot of our history as well, including gave birth to what's known as the Knights Templar. They're a monastic order. Basically what happened is these are not monks who become knights, they are knights who become monks. They gave up everything to the church, and they took monastic vows, and they went in there to secure the Holy Land. And, they were known for their tactics, because in the end, remember, they are knights. And we had a discussion about, like how do you maintain an idea of preparedness for war when you're a monastic group. Well, they ran their monasteries a lot like other monasteries. They had prayer, they had time for religious readings, they had time for communal meals, and then everything else is devoted to military practice. And so when they moved into the Middle East, especially places like Jerusalem, Acre, and other places in the Middle East, they set up huge installations. And their installations will actually last most of the Crusades. And this is actually a seal from them because they all take a vow of poverty. Now the one thing that's very interesting about knights are usually people of wealth. I mean, when you think about it, if you can afford a horse, and you can afford a suit of chainmail, and you can afford armor, you got bucks. Most people walked everywhere during this time period. If you could afford a horse, that means you could afford a Mercedes-Benz in today's time. And so if you afforded a horse, the old word for knight in French is chevalier, horseman. And so they gave everything to the church, and they took up the cross. And they'd go there, and they would secure a lot of lands for this. Also, the Knights Templar do something that is not war related. That was actually a huge boom to economic development, and it'll later bring on their downfall. They will create the modern banking system that we still use today.
The Knights Templar.
Mm-hmm. They'll create the whole idea of a ledger of debits and credits, loaning things, rate of interest, but even more important, the idea of issuing of checks. To where you could deposit money in a Templar bank in Europe, and they will give you a receipt, and you could take that receipt to a Templar bank in Jerusalem and pull your money out. And they use all the funds from these guys giving all of their wealth to the church, as well as interest loans for the fundings of the Crusades. That will destroy them. Why? Because in the late 1200s, during that Third Crusade, Philip the Fair of France is completely being financially backed by the Knights Templar. He's supporting their entire war effort for France. And when it's time that your loan is due, what do? You outlaw the Knights Templar. That's kind of like your Citibank bill arrives, and instead of paying your bill, you decide to burn down the Citibank building. That's what Philip the Fair did. He disbanded the Knights Templar, and in 1307, he had Jacques de Molay, the leader of the Knights Templar, arrested and executed. And the Knights Templar will be on the run for the rest of their lives.
So he should be Philip the Unfair.
Yeah! It all depends on your point of view. Just didn't like to pay his debts. But it also gave birth to another group of people that were also monastic knights, known as the Hospitallers. Where we get the word hospitality or hospice comes from. The idea of to give care to strangers is hospice. And so these Hospitallers were also monastic monks that took up the sword. But their main job was actually, they'll secure roads and will give aid to pilgrims making their way, as well as they'll be a major fighting force. And eventually, though, they will be forced to abandon their main part of the Middle East, and they'll reside in the small island of Malta. And they'll later become known as the Knights of Malta. And then, of course, probably the last thing that comes out of the Crusades is another group of monks will come out of this, and they're known as, the Mendicants, which are monks which will now make their entire living through begging or almsgiving, as opposed to where they produce something. Probably the most famous of the Mendicants is Francis of Assisi, where they will strictly rely on the people in everyday almsgiving for the support of their monastery. But also something very interesting happens during the Crusades too, which I will leave it to you whether it's questionary, because it is. The sale of reliquaries. What's a reliquary?
Relic.
A relic.
Boning.
Bones. I got the knuckle bone of St. John the Baptist, and it's for sale on eBay. That's pretty much what happened. And so it was a huge market during the Middle East. These people would go into the Middle East and start securing all these reliquaries, whether they're fake or not. I can guarantee there was even a huge amount of could you imagine being like the police department during that time period? I understand you have fake reliquaries. That's exactly what happened. You have no idea how many nails of the cross that were running around Europe at one given time, where everybody swore that they had the original nail of the cross. Also, probably one of the most famous reliquary is actually still on display, the Shroud of Turin. Okay?
Standing spear too.
Oh, well, yeah, the Spear of Longinus,
Shard.
the Shroud of Turin, the shroud in which they say Jesus was buried in,
Oh,
where it's stretched out in a church where it has the image of Christ on it. It's at the church in Turin. But also what's known as the Spear of Longinus, which is the spear that supposedly pierced the side of Christ, was also a reliquary during that time period too. It's not one of our finest moments, everyone. But history has its sticking points. So next time when we get together, we're going to be wrapping up the Crusades. We're going to be wrapping up the end of the Middle Ages into the beginning of the Renaissance, the beginning of how the papacy will then go head to head against the kingdom. I want to marry this girl. No, you don't. She's not the right faith. Well, forget you. I'm starting my own religion. And then, of course, we'll be going into the dawn of the Reformation. Okay, guys. Pancakes.
Great job, man.